Hong Kong has been one of the world's star performers in the COVID crisis, despite its proximity to mainland China. It ticked all the right boxes early on, from testing to masks to closing its borders. It took on board all the lessons of the SARS epidemic and has now only lost 4 lives to COVID. You might have thought that this model behaviour could earn it a gold star from its masters in Beijing. You'd be wrong. The Chinese government clearly sees COVID as an opportunity to impose some discipline on a restive stepchild. Tomorrow, the National People's Congress, the Communist Party's compliant parliament, will debate and then pass a national security law for Hong Kong. This is what the law intends to prevent, the kind of mass demonstrations that shook Asia's financial capital and rattled Beijing for much of last year. The law would ban all forms of sedition, subversion and secession, and could, in theory, be used to end even the most peaceful demonstrations. Hong Kong's mini-constitution, underwritten by Britain, its former colonial masters, requires it to introduce at some stage a national security law. So far, it has failed to do so, because when it tried, it sparked the political unrest that culminated in the Umbrella Revolution. But ever since Letgo, the Hong Kong Assembly, was defaced by pro-democracy demonstrators last summer, Beijing has been losing hope that the local legislature could pass the law. What's more, there are elections in September which could result in gains for the pro-democracy parties. So Beijing has seized the opportunity to impose the law directly, thus trampling on the spirit, if not the letter, of the one country, two systems formula. This just a few weeks after the authorities rounded up some of the veterans of the democracy movement and charged them with unlawful assembly. Beijing thinks that COVID has given it a helping hand. Social distancing means that large gatherings are not just banned, but shunned for personal safety. And the eyes of the world may be distracted by the virus. But not the eyes of Donald Trump, who has turned blaming China into his re-election slogan, and who is almost certain to use the law to up the ante in what looks like his new Cold War with Beijing.
Well, I'm joined now from southwest London by Lord Patten, who was the last British governor of Hong Kong. But first to Hong Kong and the democracy campaigner Bonnie Leung. What do you make of this new security law and what effect do you think it will have on the protest movement?
Well, I believe that with this legislation in Beijing, I'm sure that Hong Kong people will do our best to protest, because there is nothing more we can do except for protest. So I'm sure no matter individuals or organizations will organize protest as soon as possible, especially if the details is to be announced tomorrow, which is about to be explosive, which we expect them to be. But in the meantime, as you've said earlier in your video, that now we are in the middle of pandemic, even though our city is containing it pretty well. But the police and the Hong Kong government is using these kind of social distancing regulations to try to contain our protest, including in 2 weeks' time, we have been doing this June 4th massacre mourning for 30 years. But it is expected to not to be approved by the police. So in the future, we are facing a lot of challenges ahead.
So do you think people will come out onto the streets anyway now?
I'm sure we will, because in the past few months we had been, except for the few weeks that the coronavirus was very serious. Now we are doing pretty well with no local infections. I'm sure people will come out again, even though I must admit that in the now political climate, the consequences will be higher. Okay. But Hong Kong people cannot afford to lose our safety, our home, so we'll continue to protest.
Lord Patten, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has issued quite an attack on you after a recent speech you made, accusing you of sort of stirring up the protest movements, and is really critical of you. I mean, saying you're sort of meddling and will go down in history as sort of as just a historical notoriety.
Well, it's no change for me. I used to be described in that sort of way when I was governor of Hong Kong. Then when I was the European Commissioner for External Relations and responsible, among other things, for Chinese accession talks to the WTO, they decided I was a force for concord, not discord. The way the Chinese behave, and this regime in particular, is pretty predictable. If you say what they want you to say, you're a friend of China and they screw you. If you don't say what they want you to say, you're condemned for 1,000 generations. And occasionally, like me, you get remission. But what the hell? This is a frightened lot of bullies. And this is different from previous communist regimes since Mao. This has turned its back on what was happening under Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping's view of one country, two systems. And why? Because they're frightened of delivering the promises that were given to people in Hong Kong. Matt was there during the demonstrations and did some terrific reporting. And he will have told you, I know, that the people who were out on the streets getting on for 2 million weren't terrible radicals. They were ordinary mums and dads. They were young and old, and they were working class and middle class, all who wanted Hong Kong to go on having the rule of law and the sort of freedoms that you associate with an open society. And one of my worries about what's happening is that this will be very damaging for the Hong Kong economy and for its position as an international hub in Asia. This will damage Hong Kong. And I do hope that they will have think again, and that any demonstrations will help them to think again. But I also hope that any demonstrations are peaceful and will avoid violence, whatever the provocation from the police.
So you support the idea of demonstrations over this. I mean, should the British government do anything? Should it raise it at least?
The British government should be the biggest demonstrator. The British government, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary should make it clear that this is a fundamental breach of the Joint Declaration, which is an international treaty lodged at the UN. They should raise it at the UN. They should raise it with all our friends and colleagues, with Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United States, European countries. It's an example, I'm afraid, of this very simple fact, which we're going to have to live with. You cannot trust Xi Jinping's China. That's different from previous administrations. He tightened up as a dictator. He cannot abide anybody who disagrees with him. And the Chinese government, not only in Hong Kong but elsewhere, are taking advantage of the fact that everybody is concentrating quite properly on fighting the coronavirus. They're taking advantage of that to throw their weight around, to hector and to bully. And we must really learn to stand up to them.
Bonnie Leung, I mean, if people go onto the streets, is there going to be the kinds of scenes we saw before?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, the police, not only do they have the usual political tools, the legal tools that they had used, for example, rioting, public order ordinance, etc., to use them to arrest or contain the protesters. Now they have social distancing regulations as well. So in the past, according to our experience, the police and Hong Kong governments have did not restrain themselves by using these political tools, legal tools, to try to give troubles to protesters or restaurants or shops, which openly supports the yellow economy. So in the future, we can only expect that it will happen again and again.
Well, Lord Patton, while you're with us, can I ask you about something else? Because as well as being a thorn in China's side, you've been something of a thorn in the Conservative government side over the NHS surcharge, describing it as monstrous. They have changed their minds on that now. How do you feel they've handled it?
Well, I'm delighted they've changed their minds. I mean, I give them credit for that. I think it's a tribute to having a leader of the opposition who can actually raise these points intelligently and get the government to back off. And it's a tribute to those Conservative MPs who were actually putting their own reputations on the line in recognising that what the government was proposing was awful. And I'm pleased that the government turned turtle and moved away from it very quickly. They did the right thing, having done the wrong thing before.